behind now. So thank you very much. What I want to talk about as quickly as I can is basically questions about how ethics and epistemology interact for Kant in ways that are connecting up with some contemporary discussions. Is there feedback somewhere? Oh, yeah. So maybe can you still hear me if I'm standing over here and talk? Okay. So recently, a lot of students, when you go around, at least in the Anglo-American philosophical world, say they're working on the intersection between ethics and epistemology. So how do ethical and moral considerations relate to questions and theories of knowledge? The ethics of belief is usually the terminology people use. Some people are defending full-on strong pragmatism, according to which all beliefs are based in broadly practical considerations. So when you think you're going for the truth, that is in fact just a kind of broadly practical thing. You need truth for certain practical reasons. That's a strong view. There are a lot of weak pragmatists who think that so-called wrong kind reasons can sometimes be normative for belief. So a right kind reason is evidence of the usual sort of proof or anything truth conducive. A wrong kind reason is something practical or beneficial. And so there are some people who are arguing now that in some cases, wrong kind reasons can be normative for belief. And then there are a bunch of different encroachment theorists, according to which practical considerations can raise the bar or maybe lower the bar for what counts as knowledge. So normally, just suppose you don't have your phone and you're on the train and you ask somebody, is the next stop Delhi station or whatever? And the person says, yes, usually that's sufficient to count as knowing. But what if you need to get off at Delhi station for a life-saving operation and it's scheduled an hour from now and you're not? It's a really high-stakes situation, or you have a job interview, something like that. Then we might think just asking somebody, is this Delhi station coming up, isn't sufficient for knowing. It's the same amount of evidence, but the practical considerations have made it such that to know, you really have to do more. You have to borrow somebody else's phone, look at the sign on the wall outside or whatever. So there are ways in which the practical encroaches on the epistemic, and there are also moral versions of that as well, which I won't discuss for the sake of time. So these pragmatism, weak and strong, and encroachment theories and other movements in the ethics of belief is sort of an interesting way in which analytic philosophy is once again coming around to swallow its own tail. There's analytic Hegelianism now, which you would have thought at the origins of analytic philosophy with Russell and Moore could never have been something that would be analytic. But here we are, and there's also the sense in which this bringing in of the ought or the ethical into sort of questions in epistemology about how we get knowledge of what is the case is also a bit of a departure from what Russell would have wanted, for instance. So Russell says, driven from the particular sciences, the belief that the notions of good and evil must afford a key to the understanding of the world has sought a refuge in philosophy. But even from this last refuge, if philosophy is not to remain a set of pleasing dreams, this belief must be driven forth. So those Hegelians and others who think that ethics or notions of good and evil can somehow infect our conceptions of what is the case in our scientific philosophy have to be driven forth, opposed to classical pragmatists, but also people like Frege's teacher Lotze, who says very Kantian things like, the true beginning of metaphysics lies in ethics. But note that these are not so much claims about what exists, it's really more claims about what you are permitted to take to be true regarding what exists. So that's a slight and important distinction. Think about Pascal. Pascal is not saying, I have a proof that God exists. What Pascal is saying in his wager argument is, I have a proof that shows that you are permitted to believe that God exists. You're permitted to have faith that something is the case, because there's these pragmatic reasons that favor your commitment. There are some predecessors after Pascal, but before Kant, people like Meyer and Crusius, but Kant is kind of the most prominent defender of this sort of move. What I want to do in this talk is look at a few ways in which Kant's moral argument has been thought to go. I'm really only going to look at one and then turn to the one that I favor just for the sake of time. Evaluate their fit within his theory of moral motivation, and consider whether there's any ongoing appeal to these argument structures. At the end, I'll try to say something about whether Kant was himself a kind of pragmatist or encroacher, and if there's time, I'll say there's a little thing at the end about a kind of secular contemporary application of the kind of moral argument that I'm interested in. All right, so in the first critique, we were talking about this at lunch, some of us. In the first critique, Kant says, at the very end, he says, I want to talk about the question, what may I hope? Which is somehow supposed to bring together the questions, what can we know? Which is what the first critique is really focused on. And what ought we to do? Which turns out to be what the ethical works, like the second critique, are focused on. He says, what may I hope? Somehow brings the theoretical and the epistemological together with the ethical. But he doesn't have that much to say. And what he does say sounds very un-Kantian. So let me move this up. And that's why I call it the carrots and sticks model. It looks like the un-Kantian Kant of 1781 sees morality as requiring a certain kind of carrot. So this is a metaphor for, how do you get an animal to move? You put a carrot in front of it, or you have a stick behind it, and either way you get it to move. So the thought is, pure reason, pure practical, ethical reasoning isn't sufficient to morally motivate us. We also need a carrot or a stick, and Kant seems to think that's why you need God and the afterlife. So everyone regards the moral laws as commands, which, however, they could not be if they did not connect appropriate consequences with their rule a priori, and thus carry with them promises and threats. So the next quotation from a lecture note, something similar, we're obliged to be moral. Morality implies a promise. Otherwise, it couldn't impose any obligation on us. We owe allegiance only to those who can protect us. Morality alone cannot protect us. This doesn't sound like the Kant of the groundwork that we're familiar with. It looks in the first critique like part of the incentive to be moral has to do with this hope for reward or the threat of punishment. And he says that as clearly as possible here. Thus, without a God in a world that is not now visible to us but is hoped for, the majestic ideas of morality are, to be sure, objects of approval and admiration, but not incentives for intending and realizing. So, although we're in the critical period here, this doesn't feel like the Kant that we know and love in Kantian ethics. Some people want to try to save those passages, but I think we should just move on. You can move on to this second critique, and that is the classic argument, as I spell it out there in 4 premises. But I'm going to skip that for this talk because we don't have very much time. You do need to know that HG means the highest good, and that the highest good is this, we've been talking a little bit about this, the perfect correlation between virtue and happiness. And in the first premise, Kant does think that that's our duty, to will the highest good. And then via ought implies can basically comes up with I'm permitted or even required to take God and the future life to exist. So it's another from ought to is argument. And there's a lot to say about this, but I want to just pass over onto this third one that I think comes out in the Critique of Judgment and the Religion and the Theory and Practice essay in the 1790s, because I think it's got more promise and is more interesting. So in 1793 Religion, Kant is trying to give us the rational essence of various religious doctrines, trying to basically take Christianity and make it into a kind of rational religion. And he says, well, here's one way to think about the doctrine of providence. Providence can be construed rationally as the thought that each person must so conduct himself or herself as if everything depended on him. Only on this condition may he hope that a higher wisdom will provide the fulfillment of his well-intentioned effort. So the idea is that you shouldn't count on God to be doing things. You should be doing your duty yourself. And once you do that, then you may hope, so what may I hope? You may hope that God or nature or providence will somehow provide the fulfillment of your well-intentioned effort. But he's also sensitive in the religion. He says each must do this. But for many of us, sustaining that activity requires the hope that this thing will come along and that justice will be done, or that your well-intentioned effort will in fact be fulfilled, and that your efforts make some contribution to doing so. And this is something that I hear in my students a lot, that they are the ones who are not simply going off to Wall Street to make a bunch of money, and there are many of those, the ones who are sort of committed to a cause or want to go and work for, I don't know, kind of teaching in difficult school systems, or a Peace Corps kind of arrangement, or a charity, or a nonprofit. They often say they really hope to make a difference. This is a phrase that you hear all the time. So I want to make a difference. Sometimes people will come back 5 years later and say, I didn't feel like I was really making a difference. You know, these structural, gigantic problems are so huge that you feel overwhelmed and demoralized, and so now I will just go off to Wall Street and try to make money. So you see students getting demoralized by this thought that they're not really making a difference. And I think Kant is sensitive to this, although we have this cartoon version of Kant according to which he just says, do your duty, don't worry about consequences out there in the world, don't do anything more than just kind of follow the moral law. I think he is in some sense aware that some of us need more than that. We need to be able to hope for something, to be making a difference, and to having our moral activity be part of that difference. So he says in the religion we have a natural need which, if not met, would be a hindrance to resolve, to our moral resolve, to conceive of some end of all of our doings and not doings taken as a whole, one that we find justifiable. So I think there's more argument that would be required here, but I think what he's trying to say is we're susceptible to demoralization, which really has two components. There's just general despair about whether justice will ever come about, or whether the world will ever finally take a turn towards justice. And then also a second part, a kind of psychological loss of resolve to do what you continue to think you ought to do. So in English, this word demoralization, I think Robert Adams was the first person to use it in this double entendre way, but it works nicely. It's you're generally dissipated, or you feel despair about your moral life or your life in general. And what it leads you to do is basically give up on the things you believe you still ought to do. You still have a rational incentive. That's what reason gives you, is the incentive, but you are lacking now in your resolve, and that's an important difference. So reason's still telling you follow the moral law, but something in your psychology is demoralized. In the religion, he also gives us this account of what he calls fragility, which is the first degree of the propensity to evil. He says the fragility of human nature is expressed in the complaint of an apostle, what I would, that I would not do. So this is from the New Testament. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I still can't bring myself to do it. A kind of weakness of will. I adopt the good, the law, into my maxim of my will, but this good, which objectively, ideally, is an irresistible incentive, is subjectively, when I'm actually supposed to do it, the weaker in comparison with inclinations, with my other desires. So I'm somehow demoralized such that I don't do what I take myself to have moral reason to do. Now, Kant is not a divine command theorist, as we know. He's not a consequentialist of any sort. Morality doesn't need the idea of another being above him in order to recognize his duty, nor as an incentive anything other than the law itself in order to observe it. So that's like straight Kantian, do your duty. Sounds a little bit like the Gita. But he's also not a Stoic. So virtue is not its own reward. And this, I think, is where Kant does bring in some appeal to consequences in the state of the world. So we are focused on the rationality of our hope for appropriate happiness, justice, the fulfillment of our well-intentioned effort, and so forth. And in this third version of the proof, he's characterizing that hope as stabilizing our moral resolve. So it's the consequence-dependent moral psychology is saying not that what makes it right is the amount of good consequences you're producing, but rather what sustains your resolve to do what you already know is right is some hope that good consequences will resolve. And you see that in this famous passage about the righteous Spinoza. I won't read the whole thing, but some of you have the handout, have it. But he thinks Spinoza is a righteous man, but also an atheist. And he says Spinoza is going on in the moral life and somehow feels demoralized. His strivings have limits as he sees that deceit and violence and envy always continue, and righteous people suffer and wicked people prosper. And ultimately, we are all just engulfed in the grave to which all animals are destined, and says that the righteous Spinoza ultimately, when faced with this abyss, has two options. Either he will certainly have to give up his end of being righteous as impossible, or he will have to accept, from a practical point of view, the existence of a moral author of the world, that is, of a God, that's twice, from a practical point of view. So I'll give you that to you again in a step-by-step fashion, just so you can really see how I reconstruct this. The first premise is just I ought to do whatever the moral law says I ought to do, so this is a very natural starting point for Kant. Second premise is an empirical premise. For me, anyway, it would be demoralizing in the first sense. That is, it would lead to despair and dejection, not to be able to have substantial hope that there is a moral order by which the highest good will come about, for that would amount to regarding it as certain that the ultimate history of the world will not be just, no matter what I do. So it would be demoralizing not to believe that ultimately history is headed in the right direction. Such demoralization has an enervating effect on my resolve and is thus demoralizing in the second sense. It threatens my resolve to perform actions that I take to be morally required. So demoralization or fragility of this sort is seriously morally undesirable. Therefore, there's a serious moral advantage for me, given my empirical psychology, in being able to have substantial hope that there is a moral world order that will bring about the highest good. But substantial hope, if you're really committed to something by way of hope, you have to at least take it to be possible in some way. You have to take it that there are agents or powers in the actual world that can bring it about. So you need more argument for that premise, but the general thought should be clear. If you're really committed to something and hoping for it, you have to at least think that it's not pure wish. It's something that could be brought about. But then what's the explanation for something like perfect justice or the highest good being possible? Kant says the only explanation has to involve the actual existence of God and the future life. So actual existence of God, the future life, is part of the only adequate ground of the real possibility of the moral world order. Therefore, there is serious moral advantage for me, given my psychology, in being able to have some kind of positive attitude that God or the future life exist. That is, belief or faith that God and the future life exist. But for Kant, belief has to have sufficient epistemic reasons, sufficient evidence. Kant's an evidentialist about what we would call belief. And he pointed out in the first critique at great length that we can have no sufficient proofs for or against God in the future life, one way or the other. So the whole transcendental dialectic, as we were hearing this morning about illusion and metaphysics and the ways in which the dialectic is opposed to that. So belief is not justified, but faith, Vernunftglaube, does not require epistemic reasons. It can be based on practical or moral reasons. So the big conclusion, faith, though not belief, that God in the future life exists is prima facie, that is defeasibly, morally, not epistemically justified, for me at least. So it's a fairly constrained result, but for me it is permitted, if I have that kind of demoralization threat, to take on board as a matter of faith some commitment that will help shore up my moral resolve. That's the basic idea. It has a lot of advantages over some of the other forms. It has an essential role for hope to play, which the second really didn't. The first premise is weaker. It doesn't say I have to will the highest good. It just says I have to, as premise 1 says, I have to do what is morally right. It is also attractively empirical. It starts with the psychological conditions on my hope and my resolve. What do I need in order to remain on the moral path? And that's what's used to underwrite the claim that it's rational for me to hope for the highest good and then to have faith that God exists. 7 is a tricky one. 7 is about whether we need an actual ground for, here I'll go back up to 7, let's see. The actual existence of God in the future life is part of the only actual ground of the real practical possibility of the moral world order that brings about the highest good. So even if we can get to there being a need for an actual ground, why does it need to be the traditional kind of Western omni God? And here I think the psychological reading has an advantage. I think that Kant can just say, look, some people don't need any sort of postulate here. They might not have the kind of psychology that requires them to think, oh, you know, there has to be some justice at the end of things, and the arc of history has to be bending in the right way in order for me to continue in my moral life. Maybe they're really stoically impressive. Kant thinks that we are not, for the most part, Stoics. But I think if there were any Stoics, he would be impressed with them and just sort of encourage them on their way. So they might be able to soldier on in the face of an amoral universe, appreciating perhaps what Russell called the tragic beauty of morality. Others, I think, could take solace and inspiration from like a karmic theory. So if what we want is this commitment to the idea that justice will ultimately be done, that virtue and happiness will be correlated, then I think the karmic picture, I mean, you all would know this better than me, but the karmic picture, or at least some versions of it, gives you all of that without God, right? And there maybe is a future life, but it's a different kind of future life than the traditional German theology was imagining. So I think the moral psychological argument is open to that as well, or to Fichte's moral order of nature, where nature somehow itself produces a just arrangement at the end of all things and doesn't require an actual God being in control of all of that. That's what got Fichte fired from the university for suggesting this atheistic version of the proof. So that's all true. There is a kind of permissive flexibility about the conclusion here. But I think Kant can also say, look, some people do need more even than the assurance that justice will be done. Maybe in order to stabilize their resolve, they need the connection between virtue and happiness to be intended and superintended by something personal, something that cares, something that intervenes in history maybe to provide guidance and encouragement. They might even need it to be a certain kind of independent God, something that they can worship, something that is all-powerful so that the connection is totally stable. And the history of religion suggests that a lot of people need something like this. So I did take one seminar in graduate school on Vedanta philosophy, and we read the Gita and then Shankara, Ramanuja, and Madhva as commentators on the Gita. And it was interesting to me to see the way that Madhva and the Bhakti tradition are in some ways motivated, I think, by some of these same considerations, that morally speaking, it's just a lot easier if you think in terms of worship and love and devotion as part of your, what's keeping up your moral resolve, rather than the very austere metaphysics of something like the Advaita picture, where there's not much by way of kind of divine help or participation in the moral life. I think the Kantian model can accept that there's a sense in which you should go with the metaphysics that best helps your ethics. And so if what you morally need in order to sustain your resolve looks more like dualism and Krishna and worship and so forth, then good for you. If for you you're able, like Russell, to soldier on in the face of a non-dual picture where it's very hard to see anything like a God in the metaphysics, then that might be better for you. So again, ethics is leading the metaphysics. Let me just skip to this question. Is this not then didn't what I just say sound very much like a bunch of wish fulfillment or a pernicious form of Feuerbachian, like we make God look the way we want God to look? And I want to say no, I don't think it's a pure wax nose approach where we just twist God or the world to look whatever way we want it to look. There are a bunch of constraints. So remember, I can't get the right things. Okay. Remember, the justification is defeasible. So if it turns out that having this kind of faith makes you a worse person from a moral point of view, then you have to give it up. It also has to be philosophically coherent. So, it is true that there are certain religious commitments that you might think have made most of their adherents morally worse rather than morally better. And I think that there's no room for that kind of faith commitment in the Kantian scheme. It's justified morally, and so it can also be defeated morally. Remember, it's also faith, so it's not belief or knowledge. The goal is not to feel better, but to receive essential moral sustenance. And the issue must always be epistemically or evidentially ambiguous. God's existence, remember, Kant thinks, cannot be proved, but it also can't be disproved. And that's what makes it susceptible for this kind of faith. If it's something that you could have good evidence for, then you can't sort of move into this faith mode. You have to stick with knowledge. Okay, so a few upshots here to conclude. Moral argument is a key place where we see Kant's doctrine of the primacy of the practical at work. I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith, he says. So what we've done is we have denied knowledge of God and the future life, but moral psychological considerations regarding hope and resolve can still ground faith about those things. So that's what it is to deny knowledge to make room for faith. Is Kant then a pragmatist? This is complicated. So I initially wanted to say, no, knowledge and faith are just different kinds of attitudes. The wrong kind reasons are not normative for belief, but they are for faith. But then there is this issue that in the logic lectures, many of the logic lectures, but certainly the Yeshe ones that Kant approved for publication, he does seem to think of Überzeugung, conviction, as an attitude that is in some sense the genus for the species of both belief and faith. So what he calls logical conviction is pretty close to what we would call belief, and that can figure into knowledge if it has sufficient evidence. The other is practical conviction, and that just looks like another term for faith. So now it kind of looks like there's conviction, and there are two different kinds, the epistemic kind and the faith kind. And if that's right, then it does look like a kind of weak pragmatism. So sometimes practical reasons are normative for conviction. Other times it has to be epistemic reasons that are normative for conviction. And so perhaps Kant is, in fact, a weak pragmatist after all. If that's right, there would be some questions about how the same kind of attitude conviction can be both responsive to evidence in an involuntary way, such that you're getting knowledge, if it's true, and the sort of thing that you can voluntarily take on board in the right practical circumstances. So I think it feels odd to think that there's one psychological kind that is both responding to evidence and something that I can voluntarily say, okay, I'm taking on board God's existence in order to improve my moral resolve. That might not be fatal objection, but it does feel like something to work out a little bit more. Is Kant an encroacher? No, I think that the attitudes are probably different, so belief and faith involving different kinds of attitudes. But if this complication is correct and we should worry about the same kind of attitude conviction being involved, there's still no encroachment on the epistemic. Practical stakes don't make it easier or harder to have knowledge. Rather, they justify faith in contexts where justified belief or knowledge is not in the offing. So maybe a weak pragmatist, definitely not an encroacher. Okay, do I have 5 more minutes or where? Yeah, okay. So this is a final effort to say something that's not going to result in God's existence, but will show you how I think you can use this kind of argument in an interesting way that doesn't have to involve kind of special metaphysics, but shows, I think, the power of Kant's psychological form of argument. So let's just take as an example, somebody who has recently decided to become a vegetarian. You can take whatever cause you're most interested in. Maybe it's climate change or something else that you're concerned about. I teach a class on food and philosophy, and so I think about arguments regarding the ethics of eating quite a bit. So let's take this person, let's call her Vera, and say that for her it's morally crucial, in order to avoid demoralization, to sustain her substantial hope that her abstention from animal products over years will make a significant difference to the lives of the animals involved and or to the environment. So the idea is you're an ethical vegetarian because you care about the animals or you care about the environment. You care about some difference being made. And if you were to just always choose the vegetarian option, even when the really tasty meat dish is sitting right there for years and years, and be convinced that you're not making a difference to any animal or to the environment at all, that would be a real threat to your moral commitment. There is this consequence-dependent moral psychology. Even when you think this is my duty, I'm not doing it it's not right because of the consequences, there still is somehow a connection to perceived consequences that can make something threaten to demoralize us. And so what we want is for her to be able to hope that after 30 years of being a vegetarian, she will have made a significant difference to the animals and to the environment, to whatever it is she cares about. In this kind of case, and climate change is going to be similar for obvious reasons, it's very hard to have strong evidence that your little individual decisions, even over decades, are going to make much of a difference. And that's because this is such a massive system. It's global, it's perishable goods. The systems that create all the meat that we eat are not very well vertically integrated. There's a lot of tolerance for waste and buffers in the system. You order 10,000 new eggs to be incubated after a certain number of ordering decisions on the parts of consumers, but if you then don't get a sufficient number of ordering, a lot of the eggs will go to waste, so there's just tolerance for a lot of kind of messiness in the system. It's not perfectly linear, and it's just gigantic, so there are 80 billion land animals and 120 billion sea creatures harvested every year, so that's 200 billion every year. So even as I'm speaking this sentence, from the beginning to the end of this sentence, something like 10,000 chickens will have died across the world, just that sentence. So there's just a lot. And moreover, I don't have statistics for India, but there is this thing called the North American Meat Institute. I don't know what kind of an institute that is, but it's a meat institute. And they have data from CNN and the United States Department of Agriculture saying that of the approximately 6% of North Americans who claim to be vegetarians, around 2/3 of them will confess to having eaten meat in the past 24 hours, which seems amazing to me, but that's the website. You can check it out. And they say the reason is because meat is just irresistible. So the thought is, like, even those who have said, I'm going to be vegetarian, are easily demoralized and don't stick to their commitment. And so question is, what can you have faith in that would help to sort of shore up your resolve? One thing she could try to have faith in would be this claim: look, if I choose to abstain, then that will cause a bunch of other people to abstain, and so my abstaining will really make a difference. That would be one thing she could try to hold. Unfortunately, that's just obviously false, so it doesn't meet the constraint that it has to be evidentially ambiguous. She checks her social media account and sees that she only has a few hundred followers. So no matter what she does to try to cause other people to do things, it's probably not going to amount to much in the face of 200 billion animals being harvested every year. So there is, though, this other proposition, somewhat complicated proposition, but this is evidentially ambiguous. It's not something you can prove one way or the other. So it's just like what Kant says about God and the future life. You can't prove it one way or the other. But it does look like she could take this on board as an article of faith, and that would actually potentially help sustain her resolve. So that proposition says, if I choose to abstain from these products for certain reasons, then that is evidence, strong evidence, that a significant number of other people are likely to abstain for those reasons. And if I don't abstain, then that's significant evidence that other people are not likely to abstain, or they are likely to purchase. So if I purchase, they're likely to purchase. So the thought is, my behavior in response to certain reasons predicts other people's behavior. Maybe not right now, maybe you don't see that change happening right away, but over the course of 100 years, over the course of lots of space and time, you can take on faith this commitment that your response to reasons is strong evidence that other people will ultimately respond to reasons. So think about 200 years ago in the US, there were people owning slaves, lots of people owning slaves, and you might think somebody was like, I can't do this for moral reasons, I feel like this is really wrong, but everybody around me is doing this thing. How am I going to make a difference to any individual person? Well, they could take on board on faith that their reasons are good reasons, and that if they continue to do it, to be abolitionists, that is strong evidence that at some point down the road, a bunch of other people will do it as well. So I think that's a kind of Kantian thought, that good moral reasons are universalizable and will be recognized as good by all rational agents in relevantly similar situations, and that the cunning of reason is ultimately leading to progress. So that would be a moral psychological argument for Vera to prefer an evidential rather than a causal principle about the connection between her acts and the acts of others, precisely because, so she takes it on because it will allow her to retain her moral hope and resolve. Again, the result here is just defeasible moral faith about an epistemically ambiguous and perhaps theoretically undecidable principle that grounds her morally essential kind of hope, at least for her. So her moral psychology is what's requiring this. There are some further difficult questions about whether it's okay to take on faith the principle regarding what counts as evidence for what. But in any case, I think this example shows that the moral psychological version of Kant's argument has interesting legs that could allow it to run in lots of interesting directions, both metaphysical and otherwise. Thank you.
It's a beautifully structured paper, so lots of questions obviously, but I can take only go for 10 minutes. So
Okay.
there's no. Sorry, let me repeat. I can take just a few questions because if you have just 10 minutes in hand for questions. So I'll start with Professor Mitro here, or yeah, maybe
Some
from.
back there.
From,
This one here.
no. Let me start with her. Let's start. Manijiva, please carry on. Yeah, a microphone for her.
It's not a question actually. I need some clarification. You have made a distinction in your multi-layered argument. You have made a distinction between rational justified faith and justified belief.
Yeah.
So justified faith, the word I found, the German word is Vernunftglaube.
Yeah.
When you say ich glaube, we actually mean I believe or I feel like.
Yeah.
How can you interpret it as faith? That is the first one. And the second one is you have used another word, Überzeugung.
Yeah.
Überzeugung means conviction.
Yeah.
So, and you say that it covers both the genus and the species. So knowledge and as well as belief. In what sense we call it knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah, these are good and important questions. So I think Glaube in German can do two different things. So I think it can mean something like I think, or I guess, or I take it that. So ich glaube das, blah, blah, blah. But well, I think Glaube, especially the noun, capital G, Glaube, or Vernunftglaube, does have, that's what in religious contexts, in the creed, for instance, at a Lutheran church, you would say, ich glaube das, and then you'd say the creed. So I think there is a more formal religious-y sort of context in which it's playing the sort of role that I'm suggesting here. But I agree with you that there is a casual use of ich glaube that sounds a little bit more like I think that or I take it that, and doesn't have the heavy kind of practical sense that I was suggesting here. Überzeugung is translated as conviction usually, and I have typically thought that the best way of thinking of that is around what we would call belief in contemporary philosophy of mind. But there is the complication, as you said, where in the Yeshe lectures it looks like he uses Überzeugung and then says that Glaube is one species of Überzeugung. There's praktische Überzeugung. And then logische Überzeugung is more like what we would call belief. So I'm happy to use that more complicated terminology, but in the past I've typically just thought that Überzeugung is the best way of thinking about what we call belief. Yeah. Yeah. From now on, I'm stipulated. There were a couple students in the back too. I don't know. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, please give them the.
No, go ahead.
Students should be given the.
No, I will allow two more questions.
Sorry, so Professor Chignell, in a very, a paper which gives us much hope, and the thing is that, my very important takeaway from this is that that absolute, if I may put it, the demoralization, or that, if I may rephrase it as absolute pessimism, is as flawed with the transcendental illusion. So far as Professor Monidab had been talking about, insofar as it used unschematized categories to all. Whatever I may do, it will not come out to be successful. Oh, I am doomed. Here also one is using, in the guise of being practical or the guise of being realistic, one is actually laboring under a transcendental illusion. But then, what I was also another intuition that we have taken from Professor Chakraborty, and which you also followed up, that actual is the possibility of actual is the basis of making these counterfactuals or these non-actuals. So there, you have to be more geared to the actual. Suppose we are, confined to this room. Somebody closes up. Then, instead of having a demoralized attitude, we should think of other channels through which this space can be moved up, so that somebody can dig tunnels inside or up. So it is very realistically geared. So to have faith, and as you suggested wonderfully, that to derive ought, to derive ought from the is.
Is from
right?
ought.
No, is from the ought.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, to derive is from the ought means you that you have to be epistemically more geared to the reality. Epistemically geared to the reality, this actual space of the room itself throws out the possible channels. You have to be epistemically, realistically geared to that. So why were we talking about faith? That why were you talking about faith? You just be more epistemologically responsible.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, it's a good point. I'm thinking that faith only comes in when knowledge is not available. So you do have to be attuned to what's actual and what's presented to the senses and what you have.
I activate my knowledge. In order to find the different routes from this, I have to activate my knowledge. How I can dig tunnels? How can I kind of go up?
But there are but some of these things, like, is history heading in a good direction? Or can my actions really make a significant difference over decades? These are not things that you have ready-to-hand proof for one way or the other. And so it's only in those contexts when you sort of say, this is evidentially ambiguous, at least right now, so then I'm going to take on faith what I need in order to sustain my resolve. So I don't think it's supposed to be like against the evidence or irrational in that way. It's just going beyond the evidence when you can for moral reasons.
But I can extend the evidential roots through my epistemological imagination, not simply imagination. Imagination means conceivability. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I still think you're going to need the faith part.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two more questions.
There's like a bunch back here.
No, that lady up there, that in the back. You. We there.
My question was that if moral laws have to be connected to their consequences, the proverbial carrot and stick a priori, then wouldn't this make Kant's categorical imperative a sort of hypothetical imperative as well? And how do we rescue his categorical imperative in that case?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's why I said this is the un-Kantian Kant. So there's like, in 1781, he hasn't thought hard about ethics yet, and he seems to think that we need carrots and sticks to be moral. And I think that's just not something that he sticks with. And it would ruin his categorical imperative. So you're right.
Yes, someone on that side.
No, so my question is very simple actually. So I'm asking if Kant allows us the possibility to change the system or framework that we put our faith in, right? And what impact would that have on our moral character? For example, someone who is a vegetarian all her life for religious reasons gets disillusioned with the religion and moves to, for example, climate change reasons to be a vegetarian. So would that have an impact on how Kant sees the moral character of the person and whether this change is allowed in his philosophy?
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. I haven't really thought about that. So you're saying someone might be a vegetarian and end up with faith in God in the sort of classical Kantian way, and then they might give up the faith in God, but then wheel in something like this principle and have faith in this, that their actions are significant evidence that other people will act in the same way. I don't see a problem with that. It feels like you're committed to doing the morally right thing, and that's what's really important to Kant. And what articles of faith you use in order to sustain your resolve can presumably change over time.
Would the articles of faith also impact the way the moral goal is interpreted?
I think that shouldn't be the case, yeah. I think that they are there as assistance for resolve, but they don't change the way the moral law is interpreted, yeah. Because it's not divine command theory. You're not getting it from the religion. You're getting it from reason.
So to conclude the session, fantastic session. Now we talk, so we break for a few minutes and we come back for the students.
Thank you. And if anyone else had questions, feel free to approach me or write to me. Yeah, thank you.